I believe that a modern political system rests on three separate institutional pillars. So the first pillar is the state. The state is a monopoly of power. It's all about generating power and being able to use it to do things like protect the community from domestic and foreign enemies, to enforce laws, to deliver basic services, education, health, infrastructure, and the like. The second institution is the rule of law. There's a number of competing definitions, but politically, I think the definition that is the most critical is that the rule of law is a set of transparent rules that have to apply to the most powerful political actors in the system. So if the president or the king or the prime minister can change the rules as they go along, it's not the rule of law. So that the rule of law is fundamentally a constraint on power. And then the final set of institutions is democratic accountability. We define that in procedural terms these days in terms of free and fair multi-party elections, but the point of the procedures is to guarantee the substance of a political system that reflects the views and the interests and wishes of the whole community and not just the elite that happens to be running the country. So if you think about these three, they're actually in tension with one another because the state is all about creating and using power, whereas the rule of law and democracy, democratic accountability, are about limiting or constraining power, and you have to have a balance. You can't have some of one and none of the other. So if you've only got a state, then you're basically China with very limited rule of law and no democracy. You've got a tyranny. On the other hand, if you only have institutions of constraint and no state, at one extreme you could be Iraq or Syria right now, where the government can't even, is not even sovereign over its own territory, but more likely you've got something like Nigeria, where you have democratic elections, some degree of law, but a very weak state that can't enforce things, is highly corrupt, and so forth. So the final important element, and I think this is critical to the way I think about political order, is a difference between what is called a patrimonial state and a modern state. So a patrimonial state treats the state as patrimony, meaning it's the property of the people that are running it. The reason they're in politics is to make money, extract rents for themselves and their families. And basically all politics was like this up until fairly recently in human history. So a king could give away a province to a daughter as a wedding present because he literally owned the province. And so today we're too embarrassed to say that we own Russia or Nigeria or whatever outright. So we have this phenomenon known as neo-patrimonialism, where you have the outward appearance of modern institutions, but the reality is the extraction of rents by political elites. On the other hand, a modern state is a state that is impartial and impersonal in the sense that it treats citizens on the basis of their status as citizens and not because you're a cousin or the wife or a nephew of the ruler. And that transition from the patrimonial state owned by the elites and run for their own purposes, the transition from that kind of state to a modern state, I think, is the most difficult and probably the least well understood transition of all. So I actually think that democracy, which we Americans care very deeply about, is a relatively easy aspect of political development to foster. We kind of know how to run free and fair elections. So both Iraq and Afghanistan, under American tutelage, have held what you would call elections or election-like events that were, good enough to produce rulers with some degree of democratic legitimacy. But what we have failed utterly to do in either of those places is to actually produce a modern state. That is to say, a state that's got a monopoly of force, that can provide security, basic public goods, with low levels of corruption. So this is the problem I've labeled getting to Denmark, where Denmark is not the actual country Denmark. It's just this mythical, nice place that has prosperity, democracy, stability, and vanishingly low levels of corruption. And so obviously, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Haiti, all of these places where either the United States or the international community have intervened over the years. Some of them are actually democracies, but none of them is a modern state. And that's really the central problem that has been plaguing American foreign policy and what Brzezinski used to call the arc of crisis.
The term political development